Okay. Morning, guys. So I'm going to give a couple disclaimers first. There's going to be some things you agree with, some things you disagree with, and a lot of stuff in between, some things you've never thought of, just trying to add some new perspectives to everything. Please give me a chance to finish before you make up your mind, before you start throwing the tomatoes and that type of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. This week's portion is called Shoftim, or Judges. So I'm going to speak a little bit about forbidden forms of worship, some legal decisions, some authority, just those types of things. So we're going to bounce around quite a bit today. All right. Deuteronomy 16:21 through 17:5. You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make. And you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. Who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God transgresses the covenant, and he has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, the sun, the moon, or any of the host of heaven which I have forbidden. So what I want to do is, if you've been to any of my Wednesday teachings, I like to go back to the history of things. I like to go back and see where it started and how it's evolved through the ages. What that means for us today is kind of a, we do the things we do, but why do we do them? It's not intentional for the most part, but some of the practices we may or may not do may have formed in other forms of worship. So that's what I'm going to get to. First, we have a representative of the tabernacle. This was a depiction based off of descriptions in the Talmud and the Mishnah of what the tabernacle probably looked like. Today we have people from the Jewish sect revisiting what it says in scriptures, and they're trying to determine, is what we currently know the tabernacle to look like, does that fit the requirement of the Torah? This was somebody's interpretation of drawing of what the tabernacle actually looked like based off of measurements and adding to and taking from what the tabernacle actually looked like. So they're revisiting some of their traditions, right or wrong. This is the Temple of Solomon based off of another artist depiction. This one's more concrete because we have more up-to-date data as to what that looked like. A synagogue in Capernaum, and then a modern synagogue. We see it's all the flat-shaped buildings. The Asherah poles. Here we have an artist depiction of what an Asherah pole looked like and how it evolved from Hezekiah removing all the poles that are cut down. Whoops. Don't skip on me now. It evolved into large poles that people worshipped around. Some pagan traditions evolved this way. Ring around the roses. Evolved into sun god worshipped. Most of the sun god temples had an Asherah pole outside of it. It may not have been wood, but it would have been of stone or iron. Then we have Greek god temples. You can see the Asherah pole. Indian god, they built their entire temple to look somewhat similar to an Asherah pole. And then it just evolved down the centuries like that type of thing. Whoops. Who put that in my slide? Whoops. Who put that in my slide? And then we have obelisks today that we see in Washington, D.C. again. It evolved via the tradition. Did they know where it came from? Probably not. Does that make it evil? You be the judge. But it evolved, or it started in history. We can determine it specifically where it started. Evolution. We see the evolutions of both sides of worship. Things that were taught to be wrong can be forgotten with time. You make a slight transition or deviation from what's taught, and over the century it gets wider and wider as we go, and then we have some of the forms of worship that we have today. Without a system in place to make decisions and interpretations, things that are left to the norms of that society. What can be seen as traditions today with evolutions in society are going to change over time. Pagan practices. Of course, he read that earlier. Learn not the way of the nations. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of craftsmen. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with a hammer of nails so that it cannot move. Asherah poles. We have them from Mesopotamia. And then we have an 8th century monk cutting down a pagan tree. The pagans would worship under these trees. They would decorate them with silver and gold and tassels, and then they would perform sacrifices under them. And then we can see this has somewhat come full circle. We've brought it into our house. Legal decisions by priests and judges. Let's move on to this one. Deuteronomy 17:8 through 13. I'm going to read this. If any case arises requiring the decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, and one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place the Lord your God will choose. And he shall come to the Levitical priest and to the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you their decision. Then you shall do to what they declare from that place that the Lord your God will choose, and you shall be careful to do according to all they direct you, according to the instructions that they give you, and according to the decision which they pronounce to you. You shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest who stands to minister, therefore, the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die, so you shall purge the evil from Israel. And all the people shall hear and fear and act presumptuously again, shall not act presumptuously again. Authority of government. Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resist what God has appointed. And those who will resist will incur great judgment. This was a hard lesson for me to learn. I like to study politics, and when Obama was in office, I'll admit I wasn't following this. I didn't want to have anything to do with that man. I thought he was evil, and you can say what you can about that, but he was put in place by God. His authority was derived from God. 1 Peter 1, and we have to respect, we don't necessarily have to respect the man, but we have to respect the authority that was put in place. 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. We dealt with a lot of suffering and unjust suffering during that time. But, God makes it his mind and his plan that he will correct things in due time. It may be 8 years later, or it may be into the future. You have to trust the plan of God. Yeshua is our example. Then Yeshua said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Okay. The Lord puts several levels of authority in place for us. The authority of our parents. Honor your parents and your father and your mother, so that the days may be long in the land your Lord your God has given you. Deuteronomy 5:16. Honor thy father and thy mother, as Yahovah God commanded thee. Yeshua again is our example in Luke 2:48 through 52. He was in the temple. He was doing what he needed to be doing. He was worshiping his father. His mother and father came in there. Why are you here? Do you know what you've done to us? How you've made us worried? What was his response? And he went down to them and came to Nazareth, and he was submissive to them. He was submissive to the authority put over him. We think that's one of the reasons he waited until he was 30 before he started his ministry. Not only did the priests start their ministry at 30, but if you can extrapolate the age, the average life expectancy, Joseph was probably passed away at that time, so Yeshua would have been head of the household. He would have been the authority of his family. Back up, back up, back up. Come on. Come on. Authority of the family. Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your husbands to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave up himself for her. Genesis 3:16. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Proverbs 12:4. Train up a child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. In Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but who loves him diligently will discipline him. Again, many levels of authority the Lord puts in place for our families. Now that's not to be construed that someone's going to rule with an iron fist and you just have to take it. Of course, there's exceptions to the rule, and I think the Lord puts those exceptions clearly out there for us. And I'm going to get to some exceptions about some things I'm fixing to cover. Authority is given by God. And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said to him, "To you I will give this authority, and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whom I will." Satan does not have the authority to give to Yeshua, besides the fact it would be breaking Torah to worship anyone but God. And then we see this again in Luke 5:18, when the Pharisees and the Sadducees are questioning who has the authority to heal on the Sabbath, who has the authority to forgive sins. But that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins. Where does he receive that authority? From God, the only person that can give the authority. The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is derived from Numbers 11:16 through 17, Exodus 18:21 through 22, and Deuteronomy 1:15 through 18. There were three different Sanhedrins in ancient times. The three Sanhedrins would be the Sanhedrins of the cities. Each city had 120 people, would elect 3 people to represent them. That would be the groups of 3 that were by the city gates. They would judge cases based off of monetary disputes. The lesser Sanhedrin had 23 judges. According to the Talmud, you needed a minimum size of 10 men to convict. 10 versus 10, a simple majority of 11 versus 10 could not convict, and you couldn't have an even number, so we end up with 23 people in the lesser Sanhedrin. This court dealt with religious matters. Another section of it dealt with social matters and subjects of death. The Great Sanhedrin is made up of 71 judges, Numbers 11:16. We also see that in the section we're reading today in Deuteronomy 16:18. You shall appoint judges and officers in all the towns that your Lord your God has given you. According to your tribes, they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. The other verses in Deuteronomy talk about the number, grab 70 elders with me. 70 plus Moses was 71, which is where we get the 71 for the Sanhedrin. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, who hate a bribe, and place such men over the people. And then Numbers 11:24 through 25. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. He gathered 70 men of the elders of the people, placed them around the tent. Then the Lord came down and spoke to him, took some of his spirit and put it on them. He is then relaying his authority, Moses' authority, to the 70 elders. Okay. So we have of the 70 people, we have the Nazai, the prince. This would have been Moses' position. They only voted during a tie, which is what became tradition. We have the Avbet Din, or was part of the voting process, and was assistant to the Nazai, the second highest member of the council. We had 23 Cohens. They were in charge of all things related to the priestly things. 23 Levites that were in charge of the Levitical priesthood, such as that weren't Cohens. So they would have been guards, in charge of singing, music, or keeping the flocks. There are many things listed in the Torah about daily sacrifice, about a process, but the Torah is somewhat like our Constitution. It's going to give out the main points, and then it leaves the specifics up to a process. It doesn't go into the specifics of who's supposed to be taking care of the flocks. You'll find that in other sources. What music is supposed to be sung, you'll find that in other sources. And it turns into more tradition than commandment, but it still relays a certain importance. And then 23 judges from Israel. All the civil matters of Israel that had nothing to do with the temple services. A murder, a theft, something like that. Okay, Judah. So where's the authority coming from? And I think you can back up to Genesis 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from beneath his feet, until Shiloh come, until him shall be the gathering of the people, King James Version. This is one of the few times I think the NIV does an excellent job of translating this verse. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, or the ruler's staff from beneath his feet, until he whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be to his. Obviously, we're speaking of Jesus, of Yeshua. The scepter is not going to depart from Judah until Yeshua takes his place as the son of David, the son of God, in his kingly position. Judah maintains this position today. Zechariah 8:23. Thus saith Yahovah of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations. They shall take hold of the seat of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that Yahovah is with you. This is an end times prophecy. Happens right before or right after the greater Exodus, before the what am I looking for here, Rob? The coming of the Messiah. Yeah, under the great wrath of the Lord. Why is this important? There must be order in the kingdom. Judges 21:25. In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Proverbs 21:2. Every way of man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. In Deuteronomy 12:8. You shall not do according to what you're doing here today, everyone doing what is right in his own eyes. Back up. Okay. Again, why is this important? If Ephesians 21:13 says we are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel through the blood of Christ, and Romans 11 says that we are grafted into the cultivated olive tree, if we want to be a part of Israel in a covenant, that we need to ask ourselves, do the laws put in place by his Sanhedrin apply to me? It's a valid question. At a certain point, I'm not saying we have to be Jews, but, and I'll get to this, there's a difference between tradition and then something that holds a binding legal authority. Okay, a ruling and a tradition. We must understand there's a difference between a ruling and a tradition. A ruling is legally binding and a tradition is just a common way of doing things. This is where we have difficulty in determining the difference between something that was a ruling of the Sanhedrin versus something that is just a tradition. For instance, we see Yeshua arguing with the Pharisees about their tradition of Corban. The idea that something that was given to my mother and my father, I give it to God, therefore I no longer have to take care of my mother and father, is a tradition of the Pharisees. It wasn't a ruling of the Sanhedrin. It had no binding authority. Had it had a binding legal authority and Yeshua was breaking that, he would have been failing Deuteronomy 13. Because in what we just read, that the legal authority by the Sanhedrin, any man that breaks it or acts presumptuously shall be judged for that. It would be a sin. So we know that this is a tradition. The same thing with washing a pot in Mark 9. The washing of the pots were traditions, not legal authority. They held no binding legal requirement. Same thing when they were attacking him on working on Shabbat, when his disciples were crushing grain. There was a great argument amongst the Pharisees and the Sadducees and amongst the groups of people what constituted work. The Sanhedrin didn't put in a specific legal requirement that you can't pick grain on the Shabbat, so it wasn't breaking their legal traditions. Different places. Now this is where I'm going to go ahead and say that we're all in a different place in our walk with Yeshua. Some of us have been studying Torah for 15 to 20 years. They're going to see this and say, oh, duh. Some of us have been 5 to 10 years, and they're still learning Torah. Myself, I haven't been in the movement very long, so I'm still learning a lot about the movement. But I'm starting to ask the questions. So I'm not saying that by not obeying their laws or their rulings that you're sinning. We're in different levels of our walk, different understandings. This is a conversation Rob and I were having this morning, that you can't hold people that don't understand or don't believe something is wrong to the same understanding that I have. And the same thing goes with somebody that has more understanding than me. You can't hold me to your traditions or your understandings of what is right or wrong, because I don't have the same conviction. The Holy Spirit hasn't put that on me or hasn't put that on you. Um, Micah 6:8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. The number one commandment you're going to get is to love your God above all else and to love your neighbor as yourself. So, of course, that's going to be your foundation. Beyond this, as we just read, he puts a group in charge to make certain legal decisions, or else we end up where we are today with 33,000 different denominations, all declaring themselves right with no unity and no relationship. Is this what God wants? What is this? What is his intention? What is his original intent for us? The history. Emperor Theodosius forbade the Sanhedrin to assemble and declared ordination illegal, ordination a capital punishment. Any town where a rabbi was ordained would be destroyed to the last building and every person executed in it. The Hebrew calendar was based on a witness's testimony system. It became far too dangerous to collect. In 358, the Hillel II recommended a change from a mathematically based calendar, which is still being used today. This decision was the last universally binding decision by the Sanhedrin. Is this perfect? Absolutely not. Even the Jews will admit that it's not perfect. The Lord has a 7,000-year plan for the earth. Is the calendar correct? No, it's not. Everyone will admit that. There are some people out there that have figured out a more biblically accurate calendar. Obviously, there are several versions of that calendar that they've created. Do we count the sliver, the conjunction, the new moon, the full moon, etc.? There's a lot of different interpretations to that. But could you imagine 33 different denominations of Judaism all returning to the land in 1948, forced to work together with a different calendar, a different time frame, different understandings, different belief systems, different rules, and different regulations? No, it would have been chaos. It would have been utter chaos. With the exception of the Karaites, all Jewish sects use the same calendar. Before the return to the land, most Karaites did use the rabbinic calendar. Why? In my view, I think it was divine in nature. I think he was maintaining unity in the dispersion in order to bring them to the land and keep it together. I think we have a question we need to ask ourselves. Do we submit ourselves to rules and regulation for that the Sanhedrin, that a government entity put in place by Yahovah? Do we submit ourselves to their authority in order to maintain unity until he returns us to the land? The thing we have to keep in mind is the first thing Yahovah did when taking the people out of Egypt was he corrected their calendar. It's the very first thing he did. I think that's going to be the first thing he does with us when he brings us out, is he's going to correct all the mistaken traditions or rules we've put in place. The Talmud says that a king by the line of David has a veto authority on the Sanhedrin. A king of Israel, not of the line of David, does not have veto authority on the Sanhedrin. So they've even written the rules in place to correct themselves when Yeshua returns. So again, the Lord has a 7,000-year plan for us, and we need to trust the plan, is my intake on this. Skipping ahead again. Back up. Okay. Authority. Does the Catholic Church have the authority to change the Hebrew calendar? No. Do I have the authority to change the calendar? No. It can be argued that the Sanhedrin does have the authority. History shows us this was God's plan to help keep unity and order in the kingdom while the Jews were in the dispersion. I read an article in 2017 that was written in 2017 about the current Sanhedrin, or the current Sanhedrin they're trying to put in place, and how they're wishing to return to the biblically based system, which would be biblically accurate. That's according to Breaking News Israel. They're going to correct it, and then of course we know Messiah will correct all of their mistakes when he returns. But until then, they're going to maintain what the Sanhedrin put in place and follow the instructions we have in Deuteronomy 17, according to all the instructions they give you and according to the decisions which they pronounce to you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right or to the left. Again, I think they're going to correct that as soon as they put in place the next Sanhedrin. Exceptions. Now we have exceptions to every rule, every requirement. Preaching the name of Yeshua, we see this in Acts 4 through 6. The Sanhedrin in place brought Peter and a couple of the disciples in because they continued preaching the message of Messiah, the message of Jesus, and they wanted to stop them. And what's Peter's response? Whether this is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, we must judge, or you must judge. For we cannot speak, but we speak what we have seen and what we have heard. Again, Peter's deferring the decision back to the Sanhedrin. Hey, if you want to kill me, if you want to punish me for this, go ahead. But I'm going to continue doing what Yeshua said to do. Acts 5, 38 through 39. Gamaliel was the Avbet Dien from 30 CE to about 50-ish CE. Gamaliel stood in front of the Sanhedrin and said, if this is the work of man, it will fail. If this is the work of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might be found opposing God. What did they do? They didn't kill them. God, worked within the Sanhedrin, within the process in place. They spared them. They gave them a slap on the wrist and kicked them out. They praised God for having to endure the punishment. But what did Peter do? He deferred the decision back to the Sanhedrin. We can also look at this from another perspective. Did Peter have the authority to break what the Sanhedrin was doing or what they had put in place? Yes. And here's how we do it. The authority from Yeshua. Luke 24. Preach that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed to his name to all the nations. A king. According to the Gemara, a king from the line of David is charged with meting out justice and protecting the oppressed in the courtroom. They could act as the sole judge. We see this with Solomon in the courts of Solomon. A king not from the line of David could not act as a judge. Yeshua, acting as king, can make a legally binding decision. He gives this command at the end of all the Gospels. He tells the disciples, go and preach the message of the gospel. So his decision is going to supersede that of the Sanhedrin. And that's what they can fall back to for legal protection. On top of this, we can see this in Acts 15 with Peter and Cornelius. Cornelius makes alms and prayers to the Lord, supplications to the Lord about bringing him into the kingdom. What does the Lord do? He sends a vision to Peter, making a righteous judgment. Go to Cornelius and speak to him. And that's what that's what the vision of Peter's about. Not about the food, but of the fact to show Peter that all men are not unclean, and to go and speak the gospel. So again, we have the Lord working in his plan, showing Peter what he should be doing and making a legal binding decision that's supported by the process he's put in place. So that's the answer to continue preaching Yeshua's name, even if we have a Sanhedrin that may be hostile to us, because they don't have, their authority doesn't go above Yeshua's authority. Okay. Extra biblical sources. We can all agree that extra biblical sources are not divine in nature the way the Torah is. But does that mean that they don't contain truth? I'm going to submit to you there are multiple levels of truth. I can have a manual for a computer. It's not divine in nature, but it's going to show me how to work my computer. It's going to be true. I'm going to be able to operate my computer based off of it. The Mishnah and the Talmud are not perfect. But I think they are critical to understanding the operation of the temple. They give instructions behind the temple and are a great resource. Both contain practices that were done in Yeshua's time. We have to keep this in mind as well. Many of the practices that were done in the first century and even later were practices before Yeshua. Do we have any record of him going out and trying to reverse a legally binding decision, talking about the calendar? We know the calendar was changed at least partially from the Babylonian exile, and we don't see him bringing it up and trying to make those changes. Why? Probably because it wasn't part of his plan at that time. We know at the end of time, the end of age, that every knee shall bow and every name shall confess Yeshua is king. that's when we will get everything corrected. Until then, we're working within a fallen society. But I think we need to work within the society and within the guidelines that he's put in place. We have to defer the authority to the people that Yeshua and God have put above us. And I can find you, if you want 2 witnesses, I can find you 10 or 20 witnesses throughout Scripture about taking the authority of those put in place by God. So what does that mean? On the flip side, those of us that want to reject the authority put in place by God are by extension rejecting God. Whether they believe it, whether they agree with it or not. If you see authority that is placed over you by God and you reject that, as Scripture says, you're rejecting God. You are sinning. It doesn't mean we have to like everything that's put in place. It doesn't mean we have to agree with it. But at a certain time, we have to decide, do I want to submit myself to this or not? Of course, that takes, without being said, you have to ask the question, do they have the authority to begin with? Like I mentioned earlier, does the Catholic Church have the authority to make changes to the days? No, they don't. So if someone is making a change or a ruling over you and they don't have the authority, of course you don't have to submit yourself to it. But if they're following the biblical principle and the biblical office that was set in place and they do have the authority, then you have to answer the question one way or another. That's it. That went a little bit faster than I thought it was going to be. But I appreciate you guys. And then if y'all have any questions or anything like that, we can, yes.
So glad we got time.
Sure.
Okay, I've always been confused because I know how it was set up with the 70. And were those particular people, I've read where they were not, and in fact Yeshua said that they